We're sending you Caleb Anderson." Mayor Harlan Dodd dropped the letter on Lily Bennett's kitchen table like he was doing her a favor. "He can't walk, can't work, can't take care of himself, but neither can you far as this town's concerned." He smiled at his own cleverness. "Consider it a perfect match." The room laughed. Every man on that council laughed. They thought they were solving two problems at once, getting rid of a widow who wouldn't sell and a broken cowboy nobody wanted. They thought it was the cruelest joke the frontier had ever told. If you've been underestimated by people who should have known better, stay with us. Subscribe, watch until the very end, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The Bennett Ranch sat 3 miles east of Willow Creek, on land that had once been the pride of Thomas Bennett's entire life. He had broken that soil himself, hauled the fence posts himself, hand-dug the well that fed the cattle through 2 brutal summers. When fever took him in the spring of 1885, he left behind 40 acres of rocky promise, a herd that was dwindling, and a wife who refused, absolutely refused to let any of it go. Lily Bennett was 34 years old and had the kind of face that made people think she was soft right up until the moment she looked them dead in the eye. She was not tall. She was not loud. But there was something in the set of her jaw that men like Mayor Harlan Dodd had learned to find deeply inconvenient. She had turned down 3 separate offers on the ranch in the 6 months since Thomas died. The first offer came from Dodd himself, delivered over the counter at the general store with a sympathetic tilt of his head and a folded envelope. She handed the envelope back without opening it. The second came through his lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne named Whitmore, who showed up at her door on a Thursday morning with a leather satchel and the practiced smile of someone who believed every problem had a price. Lily listened to him talk for 4 minutes, then told him the road back to town was easier to find in daylight, and he should probably start walking. The third offer arrived as a letter formal and sealed with the town council's official stamp, citing concern for her welfare and the stability of the surrounding properties and the long-term development of the region, and about 9 other things that all translated very simply to, "We want your land, and we are running out of patience." She used that letter to start the stove fire on a cold April morning and did not think about it again. But Harlan Dodd thought about it. I thought about it through April and into May, and by June he had stopped thinking and started planning. The Bennett land sat at the western edge of the valley and the creek that ran through it. Lily's Creek, Thomas's Creek, the one they'd built the whole ranch around. That creek was the only reliable water source for miles in any direction. Dodd had investors coming from Denver, men who were talking about cattle operations on an industrial scale, men who needed that water, and Lily Bennett was standing in the way with nothing but a dead man's deed and an iron will. Dodd needed her gone. He needed her desperate enough to sell or broken enough to leave or. And this was where the cruelest corner of his mind went to work. He needed her situation to become so impossible that the town itself would turn against her. That was when someone mentioned Caleb Anderson. The story of Caleb Anderson was the kind of story that Willow Creek told in low voices, the way people talk about things that make them uncomfortable. 3 years ago, his name had meant something in this part of Wyoming. He had been a mountain guide, the best one in the territory, the man ranchers hired when the passes closed and the trails disappeared under 3 feet of snow, and they still needed to move cattle or supplies or themselves from one side of the range to the other. He knew the mountains the way other men knew their own kitchen. He could read weather 3 days out by the feel of the air. He had pulled 2 men out of a river crossing that killed their horses. He had tracked a stolen supply wagon through a blizzard at night and brought it back without losing a single crate. I was 28 years old and built like the mountains he worked in, wide through the shoulders, quiet, in the way that meant he was always thinking, always reading the land ahead of him. Then came the rock slide. Nobody talked about exactly what happened, because the man who had been with him on that trail came back shaken and white-faced, and only said that Caleb had pushed him clear of the falling rock and taken the full weight of it himself. They found Caleb at the bottom of a 40-foot slope alive, which was the miracle, and broken in ways that no frontier doctor had the tools to fully fix. He spent 8 months unable to move at all. Then slowly sensation came back to his arms, his torso, most of his upper body. But his legs, the legs that had carried him across mountain passes and through chest-deep snow and up slopes that would have stopped most men. His legs did not come back the way they were supposed to. He could stand for short periods. He could drag himself a few steps with the help of 2 crutches. But the fluid, effortless movement that had defined him was gone. The mountain cowboy was grounded, and Willow Creek, a town that judged a man entirely by what he could do with his body, did not know what to make of him anymore. He had been living for 14 months in a back room at the Widow Calloway's boarding house, paying his keep with what little remained of his savings, refusing charity, refusing pity, refusing most visitors. The few people who still came to see him described a man who had turned his face toward the wall and was waiting for time to pass. Dodd heard this and felt with the cold satisfaction of a man who believes the world exists to serve his purposes that he had found his solution. He brought the idea to the town council on a Tuesday evening in mid-June. The meeting room above the hardware store smelled like sawdust and lamp oil, and there were 7 men seated around the long table, and not a single one of them said what should have been said, which was that what Dodd was proposing was not a solution, but a cruelty dressed up in practical language. "The Bennett woman needs help she can't afford to hire," Dodd explained, spreading his hands in a gesture of pure false reasonableness. "Caleb Anderson needs a place that isn't a charity room. We put them together. The town stops carrying the cost of one, and the widow gets more than she bargained for. Or less. Either way, the problem sorts itself." He said it with a smile. He actually smiled. Nobody around that table said a word against it. They sent the letter to Lily's ranch 2 days later, phrased as a community arrangement, a practical solution for the mutual benefit of 2 struggling members of the Willow Creek community. The language was almost kind. Underneath, every person in that meeting room expected the same thing. Lily Bennett would find herself overwhelmed. Caleb Anderson would find himself humiliated. And within a month, 2 problems would collapse under the weight of each other, and the land would finally be available. They were very proud of themselves. The morning they brought Caleb to the ranch, Lily was mending fence line on the south pasture alone, her hands wrapped in leather work gloves, and her mind on the fact that she had 17 head of cattle, a roof that leaked in 3 places, and exactly $41 to her name. She heard the wagon before she saw it. She straightened up and watched it come down the track, Dodd himself in the driver's seat, which told her immediately that something was wrong, because Dodd did not make personal deliveries to ranches he hadn't yet managed to steal. She pulled off one glove as the wagon stopped. There was a man in the back, big through the shoulders, dark hair going a little too long over his collar, 2 wooden crutches lying flat beside him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the mountains the way a man looks at something he loves and can no longer reach. Dodd climbed down from the wagon with the elaborate care of a man who never does physical labor, and he put on his warmest smile and explained the arrangement in terms so friendly that Lily felt her skin crawl. "The council thought this would benefit you both." Dodd finished clasping his hands together in front of him. "You get an extra set of hands, well, in a manner of speaking, and Caleb here gets out of that boarding house. Seems like a natural fit." Lily looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "Does he want to be here?" The question seemed to genuinely surprise Dodd. He hadn't thought to ask. "Well, now that's—" "Does he want to be here?" she said again, and this time she was looking past Dodd, looking at the man in the wagon, and she raised her voice just enough to carry. "Mr. Anderson, do you want to be here?" The man in the wagon finally looked at her. His eyes were dark and very direct and held about as much warmth as a stone wall. "No," Caleb Anderson said flatly. "I do not." Dodd made a flustered sound. "Now, Caleb, we discussed. I know what we discussed." Caleb reached for one of his crutches and got himself upright in the wagon bed with the practiced grinding effort of a man who had learned to do everything the hard way. "And I also know I'm out of money, I'm out of time, and I'm out of other options. So here I am. Doesn't mean I have to pretend I want to be." He looked at Lily again. Something in her face had shifted. "That's the most honest thing anyone said to me in 6 months," she said quietly. Then she pointed toward the house. "Bunkhouse is around back. The cot's decent. I can't pay you, but you'll eat." She turned back to the fence line. She didn't wait for Dodd's reaction. She didn't watch the wagon leave. She just pulled her glove back on and went back to work. Behind her, she heard the creak and labor of a man getting himself down from a wagon on two crutches, and she made a very deliberate choice not to turn around and offer help. She understood, without knowing anything else about Caleb Anderson, that the worst thing she could do to him in that moment was offer help. The first 3 days were the silence of two people circling each other, not out of hostility, but out of extreme caution. Caleb appeared at breakfast the first morning because the smell of coffee dragged him out despite himself, and he sat at the far end of the table and took his cup and said nothing except a flat, "Thank you," that sounded like it had cost him something. Lily set food in front of him and didn't comment on the way his hands shook slightly when he reached for his fork, and didn't look at him when he lowered himself into the chair with a sharp, bitten-off sound that was clearly pain. She hated pity being directed at her. She would not aim it at him. He was gone from the kitchen before she'd finished her own coffee, and she heard the slow, uneven sound of crutches on the packed dirt outside, and then silence. She found out what he'd been doing when she came around the corner of the barn 2 hours later and found him sitting on an upturned bucket, the entire tangle of broken harness she'd been meaning to repair for 3 weeks, spread across his knees, his big hands moving through it with complete authority. She stopped. He didn't look up. "This stitching is wrong on the left trace." Whoever did this last either didn't know what they were doing or was in too much of a hurry. "The whole thing'll snap the next time you put real weight on it." She looked at the harness. She looked at him. "I know. I've been meaning to fix it. I'll fix it," she almost argued. The words were right there. She could feel them, the automatic response of a woman who had learned to do everything herself because no one else was available, and because asking for help had a habit of coming with a cost. But she looked at his hands. She looked at the way he was already sorting the leather with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. "All right." She walked past him into the barn, and neither of them said anything else. That was how it went those first weeks. Caleb didn't ask permission. He didn't offer explanations. He found things that needed doing, things he could do from a seated position, or with the crutches and sheer stubbornness, and he did them without commentary. The harness. A broken hinge on the barn door that had been banging in every wind since Thomas died. A section of the water trough that had sprung a slow leak and was wasting 2 gallons a day. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't ask about Thomas. He didn't offer opinions unless she asked, and even then, he kept them short. Lily respected that more than she'd expected to. The first real fight happened at the end of the second week. She came home from town with the supply wagon flour, salt, lamp oil, the bare minimum, and she had a bruise on her wrist that she hadn't bothered to hide because there was nobody to hide it from. Except that Caleb was sitting on the porch steps when she pulled in, and he saw it the second she climbed down from the wagon seat. He said nothing for the length of time it took her to start carrying bags toward the house. "Dodd's man," he finally said. She didn't stop walking. His lawyer, Whitmore. He had another offer. "And the wrist." She stopped then. Not because she wanted to explain, but because the flatness of his question, no alarm, no dramatic reaction, just the blunt delivery of a man who needed the facts, was somehow easier to answer than concern would have been. "He grabbed it when I tried to walk away. I walked away anyway." There was a sound from the porch steps that she realized after a moment was Caleb getting himself upright. "I'll go to town." "You will not." "Lily, you will not go to town." She turned around to look at him and let him see that she meant it entirely. "If you go to town on those crutches and confront Whitmore, Dodd gets exactly what he wants. You make a scene. People talk. They say the widow's cripple is starting trouble. You think that helps us." Something moved across his face. It might have been anger. It might have been the particular pain of knowing she was right. "Us," he said very quietly. The word caught her off guard. She realized she'd said it without thinking. "The ranch. I meant the ranch." She turned back toward the house and carried the rest of the bags herself, and he stood on the porch and watched her, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the word hung in the air between them after that. Small. Enormous. Us. She started to see it around the 3rd week. the difference between helpless and grounded. She had assumed without meaning to, without knowing she was doing it, that Caleb's limitations were the shape of the man. That the thing he couldn't do was the measure of what he was. The same assumption the town had made. The same assumption she had unconsciously inherited from people who thought utility was the same thing as worth. But Caleb Anderson was not a diminished man. He was a mountain guide who had been removed from mountains. He was an expert who had been stripped of the terrain he was expert in, but the knowledge, the deep structural bone-level understanding of land and weather and animals, none of that had gone anywhere. She discovered this on a Wednesday morning when she came in from checking on the cattle and told him while pouring herself coffee that 2 of the steers were moving wrong, not limping exactly, but reluctant, hunched, favoring something. He asked her 4 questions. What were they eating? Where had they been in the last 3 days? What did the east pasture grass look like right now? Had she smelled anything sour near the creek bend? She answered each one, and he sat with his coffee going cold in his hands and worked through it the way she imagined he used to work through mountain trails, carefully, methodically reading the information until the answer emerged. Wet clover. If the creek bend flooded after that rain last week and then receded, you'll have a patch of wet clover that looks fine but isn't. It bloats them. Move them to the north pasture and don't let them near the bend for 10 days. She went out and checked the creek bend. Wet clover. Exactly as he'd said. She moved the steers. They were fine within 2 days. She came back in that evening and put a cup of coffee in front of him fresh hot and didn't say anything. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. Thank you. He nodded once, and that was all, and somehow that was the moment when the architecture of what they were to each other began to quietly, invisibly shift. Then came the Thursday that Reverend Moore showed up. Moore was a well-intentioned man with a habit of acting on other people's behalf without asking if they wanted his intervention. He arrived at the ranch in the late morning with his hat in his hands and his finest expression of pastoral concern, and he sat across from Lily in the kitchen and told her that the town was talking. People are concerned, he said carefully, about the propriety of the arrangement. A widow woman, a man living on the property. People will talk, Lily said. Yes. They're already talking. Well, yes, but Reverend Moore. She set her coffee down. With great respect, and I do have respect for you, I want to be clear about that. The people of Willow Creek have been talking about me since the week Thomas died. They talked when I turned down Dodd's first offer. They talked when I didn't sell out and move somewhere easier. They talked when I stayed through the winter alone. Are you suggesting I should make decisions about my life based on what those particular people choose to say about it? Moore opened his mouth. He closed it again. From the hallway, she heard the unmistakable slow cadence of Caleb's crutches. She didn't turn around. Neither did Moore. Reverend. Caleb's voice came from behind her, and she could hear that he'd stopped in the doorway. I appreciate you coming out here, I do. But this woman has been running this ranch alone since March. She doesn't need protection from gossip. She needs people to stop creating situations that require protecting. A pause. With respect. Moore cleared his throat. He looked at Lily. He looked toward the doorway. I'll convey that. To those who expressed concern. I'd appreciate it, Caleb said pleasantly, and the sound of his crutches retreated back down the hallway. Moore left 10 minutes later, and Lily sat at the kitchen table after he'd gone and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed very carefully because something had happened in the last few minutes that she did not quite know how to name. He had defended her, not in the way men usually defended women on this frontier, not by standing in front of her, not by speaking over her, not by implying she needed protection from her own choices. He had walked in, let her speak first, waited for the moment when his voice would add something she had already said, and backed her up from beside her, not from in front. She had never had anyone do that before, not even Thomas, whom she had loved deeply and still grieved with real physical weight in her chest. Thomas had been a good man, but Thomas had also sometimes spoken for her when she had words of her own ready. Caleb had waited. She sat with that for a long time in the empty kitchen, listening to the wind and the distant sound of cattle, and she thought about the words she'd said without meaning to, 3 weeks ago. Us. The letter arrived on a Friday at the end of July, delivered not by post but by hand, dropped on her porch step by a boy from town who was gone before she could ask him anything. It was from Whitmore Dodd's lawyer, and it was not an offer this time. It was a notice. The language was impenetrable on purpose, layered in legal terminology that was designed to confuse and intimidate. But the core of it was this: Thomas Bennett's original deed. It claimed contained an error. A survey error. The western boundary of the property where the creek ran was disputed, and the dispute had been filed with the Territorial Land Office, meaning the ranch's legal status was now in question, pending review, a review that could take 18 months, during which time Lily would be barred from selling, barred from making improvements, and financially responsible for all legal costs. She read it twice, standing on the porch, and then she went inside and sat at the table and read it a third time more slowly. Then she set it down and pressed both palms flat on the wood and thought with the cold clarity of someone who has already survived the worst thing they could imagine that she was not going to cry about this. She was going to think. Caleb came in from the barn 20 minutes later. He took one look at her face and sat down across the table without asking. She slid the letter to him. He read it. He read it the way she'd read it, once fast, then once slow. His jaw tightened once, and then he was very still, and she watched him the way she'd watched him figure out the cattle problem, processing, organizing, working toward something. "He doesn't actually have a case," Caleb said finally. "How do you know?" "Because I know this land." He looked up at her. "I've worked every pass, every trail, every water source in this valley for 6 years. The creek that runs through your western boundary, that's not disputed. That creek has been the Bennett property line since the original survey in 1871. I know because I used it as a navigation point a dozen times. Dodd is manufacturing a dispute, not finding one. Knowing it and proving it aren't the same thing." "No," he said. "They're not." He was quiet for a moment. "But I know who did the original survey." She stared at him. "Who?" "A man named Asa Pruitt, retired. Lives up near Clearwater, last I heard. He's old, but he's sharp, and he keeps records, the original field notes, the stake measurements, all of it. I helped him navigate 2 survey trips back in 80 and 81. He paused. "He'd remember me." Lily looked at him across the table. Outside, the afternoon wind was picking up, pulling at the corners of the house. The legal notice lay between them like a thrown gauntlet. "Clearwater is 4 days' ride." "I know." "Can you make that trip?" The question landed in the space between them, and neither of them moved. Because it wasn't just a logistical question, and they both knew it. It was the question underneath all the other questions, the one she hadn't asked yet, because asking it meant acknowledging everything that was true about his situation, and acknowledging it out loud felt like crossing a line they'd been carefully skirting for weeks. Caleb looked at her steadily. "With the right horse and the right rig, and someone who doesn't waste time asking if I need help every 20 minutes. "Yes." She almost smiled. She didn't quite. "I wasn't planning to." "I know you weren't." A beat of silence. "We'll leave Monday," Lily said. "I'll need to arrange for the Halverson boy to check on the cattle." "Monday works," Caleb said. He picked up the legal notice and folded it carefully and set it aside. The way you set aside something you're done being afraid of, and went back out to the barn. Lily sat at the table for another minute. She thought about the first morning he'd arrived, the set of his face against the mountains, the flatness in his voice when he'd said, "I do not." And she thought about the man who had read that legal notice with cold precision and immediately started solving it. And she thought about how wrong the town of Willow Creek was about almost everything. They had sent this man to her as a joke. She was beginning to think the joke was on Harlan Dodd, and that Monday morning was going to be the beginning of proving it. They left before sunrise. Lily had the wagon hitched and loaded by the time the sky was still that deep pre-dawn purple that made everything look like it was holding its breath. She'd packed light 2 bedrolls a week's worth of provisions. Thomas's old rifle wrapped in oilcloth under the seat. She hadn't slept much. She'd spent most of the night going over the legal notice again, parsing every line for what Dodd was really claiming, and she'd come to the same conclusion: Caleb had the claim was manufactured. But manufactured things could still do real damage if they went unanswered long enough. Caleb was already outside when she came around the corner of the house. He had his crutches planted in the dirt, and he was studying the hitch on the wagon with the focused attention of someone who found problems to solve in everything, and he didn't look up when she approached. "Left trace is a little loose." "I know. I was going to tighten it." "Already did." She stopped. She looked at the trace. He had in fact already done it, neat correct, the leather pulled to exactly the right tension. She didn't know how he'd managed it from where he was standing, and she did not ask, because she had learned in the last few weeks that asking Caleb Anderson how he'd done something he'd clearly already done was the fastest way to make him go quiet for an hour. "All right, let's go." Getting him into the wagon seat took about 45 seconds and zero assistance from her, though she stood close enough to catch him if he needed it, and he knew she was doing exactly that, and neither of them said a word about it. He pulled himself up with his arms. The man had arms that could have moved boulders, she'd noticed, and settled himself with his crutches propped on the footboard, and he took the reins from her without being asked. She raised an eyebrow. "I can drive a wagon," he said flatly. "I didn't say anything." "You made a face." "I didn't make a face." "You made the face you make when you're about to be polite about something you don't believe." She climbed up on the other side and sat down and looked straight ahead at the dark road. "Drive the wagon, Caleb." He drove the wagon, and just like that, quietly without ceremony, they were on their way to Clearwater, a widow and a mountain cowboy, and a 4-day road, and everything between them that neither of them had figured out how to name yet. The first day was mostly silence, which suited them both. It was the kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full loaded with the hum of two people thinking alongside each other, noticing the same things in the road ahead without pointing them out. Lily watched the country roll by. Caleb kept his eyes moving the way she'd noticed he always did, outdoors scanning the ridgeline, reading the clouds, checking the horses with small adjustments of the reins that were so subtle she barely saw him make them. The man was in his element. Not in the mountains, not on foot, the way he'd been built for, but outside, moving through the land, doing something purposeful. She could see it in the line of his shoulders, the way some deep tension in him had quietly released. They stopped at midday, near a creek crossing, to water the horses and eat. Lily set out the food on the lowered tailgate: cold biscuits, dried beef, 2 apples, and Caleb moved himself from the wagon to a flat rock nearby with the practiced efficiency she'd come to recognize as his way of refusing to make his mobility anyone else's problem. He ate without looking at the food much, his eyes still moving over the terrain ahead. The pass north of Clearwater, without preamble. "It'll be accessible this time of year. We can shave half a day off if we take it." "Is it rough going?" "For the wagon, manageable. For a man on 2 legs, it'd be nothing." A pause that landed briefly and then passed. "For a man on 2 crutches, it'll require some arrangement." She looked at him. He was still watching the pass. "What kind of arrangement?" "I'll need to ride the horse rather than the wagon for that section. The wagon can't navigate the trail, but a horse can, and I can handle a horse." He glanced at her then. "Before you ask, yes, I've done it since the accident. I'm slower mounting and dismounting, but once I'm seated, nothing's changed." She believed him. Not because she had no doubts, but because the certainty in his voice was not the bravado of a man trying to prove something. It was the flat authority of a man stating a fact. "All right, we'll take the pass." He nodded once and ate the rest of his apple in silence. She ate her biscuit and thought about the way he'd said, "Nothing's changed," meaning on horseback in the saddle, doing the thing his body still knew how to do. And she thought about how precise that was. Not everything's fine. Not a denial of what had happened to him. Just an accurate assessment of what was still true. She had started to notice that Caleb Anderson was one of the most precise people she'd ever met. He did not exaggerate his limitations, and he did not minimize them. He simply reported them the way a surveyor reports the actual lay of the land instead of the land he wishes were there. Thomas had been an optimist. She had loved that about him. He'd always believed things were going to be better than they probably were, and sometimes that had been wonderful, and sometimes it had cost them. Caleb was not an optimist. I was something she didn't have a clean word for. A realist with reserves, maybe. A man who saw everything clearly and then found a way through it anyway. It was a different kind of strength than Thomas's, and it unsettled her in a different way, and she was not ready to think too carefully about what that meant. She packed up the food, and they got back on the road. The second day was when everything got harder. Not between them, strangely, something had eased slightly after the first day on the road, some small release of the formal distance they'd been maintaining on the ranch. No. What got harder was the road itself, and the news waiting at the first proper way station they stopped at on the afternoon of the second day. The way station keeper, a heavy-set man named Gruber, who ran the place with his wife and kept up with regional news. The way some people kept up with the weather, came out to help them water the horses, and immediately got a look on his face when he saw Caleb that Lily did not like. It was a pity look. Caleb saw it too. She watched his face go flat. "Caleb Anderson," Gruber said slowly, like he was identifying something he hadn't expected to see still alive. "Well, it's been a while." "Gruber." Caleb's voice was perfectly level. "I heard well. How are you keeping?" "Fine. We need water and whatever news you have on the road north." Gruber absorbed the redirection and shifted to practical matters, but not before one more glance that slid down to the crutches and back up. Caleb was looking at the horses. Inside, while Gruber's wife put out coffee, Gruber leaned across the table and dropped his voice. "You folks heading to Clearwater? There's something you ought to know." He looked at Lily. "You're the Bennett widow, aren't you, from Willow Creek?" Her stomach tightened. "I am. Dodd's already sent a man." The words landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. She kept her face very still. "To Clearwater. To everywhere between here and there that might do you any good." Gruber spread his hands. "I hear things. People talk at way stations. Man named Pryor rode through here 2 days ago heading north. Dodd's man, everyone knows him. Big fellow. Not subtle." He paused. "I don't know what he's after up that way, but the timing isn't coincidence." Lily looked at Caleb. Caleb was very still, the coffee cup in his hand going cold. He was thinking. "Pruitt," he said quietly. "That's what I'm thinking." Gruber looked between them. "You know somebody up there?" "Someone who can help us," Lily said carefully. "Someone Dodd apparently already knows about." Gruber rubbed the back of his neck. "Then you might want to move faster than you planned." They pushed longer that evening than they'd intended, past the comfortable stopping point, and into the blue dark edge of dusk, and they made camp on the far side of a creek crossing with the horses picketed on good grass, and a small fire that Caleb built with the economic efficiency of a man who'd made 10,000 camps and never wasted a stick of wood. He sat across the fire from her, and for a while, neither of them spoke, both processing what Gruber had told them, both turning it over. "Pryor's 2 days ahead of us," Lily said finally. "Maybe less. He's on horseback and riding fast. We're in a wagon." Caleb poked at the fire. "But we have something Pryor doesn't." "What?" "I know where Pruitt actually lives." He glanced up at her. "Dodd's man will have a name and a general location. Clearwater's not a small territory. Pruitt doesn't live in the town, he lives 6 miles northeast of it, up a trail that isn't on any printed map. I've been to his cabin 3 times. Pryor could spend 2 days just trying to find the place." Lily felt some of the tightness in her chest loosen. "You're sure of the trail? I surveyed that country with Pruitt. I could find his cabin in the dark." She looked at him across the fire, and there was something in the steadiness of his voice, not boasting, just fact, just the mountain guide, telling her what the trail looked like, that she realized she had come to depend on in a way that frightened her slightly. "What does Dodd want with Pruitt?" she asked. "If Pruitt's records prove the survey was legitimate, then he needs to either get the records or discredit the man who kept them." Caleb set the stick down. "Pryor won't threaten him outright. That's not how Dodd works. He'll make an offer. He'll offer Pruitt money for an amendment to the original field notes. A small change, a tiny error conveniently discovered. Pruitt's old, he's on his own out there. Dodd will bet he can be persuaded or pressured." The fire popped. Somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted. "Can he?" Lily asked. Be persuaded. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The fire moved across his face in a way that made him look briefly like the man in the stories she'd heard, the one who had moved through blizzards, who had pulled men out of rivers. Asa Pruitt is the most stubborn human being I have ever met in my life. And I have met you. A startled sound came out of her. She hadn't expected it. The dry delivery, the glint of something almost like warmth that accompanied it, and she caught herself and pressed her lips together and looked at the fire. Get some sleep. Yes, ma'am, he said, and somehow that was funny too, and neither of them smiled, and both of them did. The third day they made the pass. Caleb transferred to horseback at the base of the trail, exactly as he'd said. No drama, no assistance beyond Lily, holding the horse's head steady, while he mounted, which he did by sheer arm strength, and a technique she could see he'd developed specifically for his situation. Once he was in the saddle, the change in him was immediate and striking. His whole body relaxed into an authority it hadn't quite had on the ground. Up there was, unambiguously, the man who knew where he was going. He moved the horse forward onto the trail without hesitation, and Lily fell in behind with the wagon on the widest portion, and they made it through the pass in 3 hours, at the top before the descent. He stopped the horse and looked out at the country below, the long folded valley. The dark line of timber, the distant glint of what had to be Clearwater Creek, and she watched him look at it from the wagon seat behind him. His face was turned away from her. She couldn't see his expression, but there was something in the set of his back, in the stillness, that told her this was a man sitting in the middle of something significant. He was seeing the mountains from inside them, the way he used to from horseback, from height, with the whole country spread out below, and nothing between him and the horizon. She didn't say anything. She gave him that moment, the way he'd given her the harness to fix herself when she needed to, by staying close and staying quiet. After a little while, he moved the horse forward. They started down. They found Pruitt's cabin late on the afternoon of the third day, which was faster than Caleb had predicted, and faster than Dodd's man could have hoped for, and that fact alone felt like a small, fierce victory. The cabin was everything the word suggested. Tight, low, built by a man who understood winter and privacy equally. And there was smoke coming from the chimney, and a pair of old boots on the porch step, which Caleb said meant the old man was home. Asa Pruitt opened the door before they'd fully stopped, and Lily had a moment to register that he was older than she'd imagined, 70. If he was a day, white-haired, narrow-shouldered, with eyes so pale and sharp they looked like chips of winter sky. Those eyes went immediately to Caleb and stayed there. "Well," Pruitt said, "I heard you were done." "You heard wrong," Caleb said. "I generally do." Pruitt came off the porch with more agility than his age suggested, his pale eyes moving briefly to the crutches, then back to Caleb's face, then to Lily. "Who's she?" "Lily Bennett. Her land's why we're here." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment, the way surveyors look at things, measuring. "Bennett. Thomas Bennett's widow, the Willow Creek parcel." Her attention sharpened. "You know the property." "I surveyed it." Pruitt crossed his arms. 14 years ago. Clean work. Good stakes. There's nothing wrong with that deed." He paused. "Is somebody saying there is?" "Harlan Dodd," Caleb said. "He's filed a dispute with the territorial office. Claims a survey error on the western boundary." The temperature of Pruitt's expression dropped about 15 degrees. "The western boundary," he repeated very carefully. "The creek line." A silence stretched across the porch. Pruitt uncrossed his arms. He turned and went back inside, and after a beat, just a beat, the length of 2 heartbeats, he said from inside the cabin, "You'd both better come in." Pruitt's field notes were something to behold. 40 years of surveys in stacked leather ledgers, organized by region and year, each page covered in tiny, immaculate handwriting. He found the Bennett survey in under 3 minutes, which told Lily he knew exactly where it was, and probably had since before they'd arrived, maybe since Dodd's man had passed through asking questions. "Pryor came by yesterday morning," Pruitt confirmed, not looking up from the ledger. "Representing a land investment group out of Denver. Offered me $200 to clarify a measurement discrepancy." He turned a page. "I told him I didn't have measurement discrepancies. He offered $300. I showed him the door." He'll come back, Caleb said. Let him. Pruitt laid the ledger open on the table in front of them. The original stake on the western boundary was set at 43 feet east of the creek's center channel. That creek has not moved. The stake is still there if someone were to go look. He stabbed one finger at the page. There is no error. What Dodd is filing is fraud. Lily looked at the page. Clear numbers, clear measurements, a small, neat diagram that matched the layout of her ranch with absolute precision. The creek her cattle drank from the water. Thomas had built his whole operation around it, was right there in 14-year-old ink, documented and undeniable. Her throat tightened. Can we get a certified copy of this? She asked. You can have the original. Pruitt looked up at her then, and his pale eyes were very direct and completely unafraid. I'm 71 years old, and I have no patience left for men like Dodd. He wants to manufacture a land dispute using my work. He can do it while I testify in person to the contrary. He closed the ledger and slid it toward her. Take this. I'll write a statement tonight. Lily put her hands on the ledger. She thought about the letter on her kitchen table. The legal language, the designed intimidation, the cold calculation behind it, the assumption that a widow and a broken man would be too overwhelmed to fight back properly. She thought about Caleb reading that letter and saying, I know this land with absolute unshakable certainty. Thank you, she said, and meant it with everything she had. Pruitt waved a hand dismissively. Don't thank me. Correct the record. He looked at Caleb. You look terrible, by the way. You've lost weight and you're favoring your left side. Thank you, Asa. Are you eating? When someone feeds me. Pruitt looked at Lily. Lily looked back. He eats? Good. Pruitt stood up and went to his stove. Then you'll both eat again now, and in the morning you'll start back, and you'll go faster than you came, because Pryor will eventually figure out he's been beaten, and he won't be happy about it. They were back on the road by first light. Caleb rode the horse again through the pass, and this time Lily found herself watching him differently, not with the careful monitoring attention of the first crossing, but with something simpler and harder to name. He moved through the high country like he belonged to it and it to him. Every instinct sharpened, every sense engaged. Up here with the mountains close, he was not a man the town of Willow Creek had set aside. He was exactly who he was. She looked away from him and watched the road. The ledger was wrapped in oilcloth in the back of the wagon along with Pruitt's written statement. She kept thinking about it the way you keep thinking about a weapon you didn't know you had until you needed it. Dodd was going to be very surprised. She was beginning to let herself believe that. But that was when Pryor found them. He came out of the timber on the south side of the descent road, big as Gruber had described, and not subtle also as described, with another man she didn't recognize riding close behind him. They positioned their horses across the narrowest section of the road, and Pryor raised a hand as if this were a polite traffic arrangement rather than what it clearly was. Lily's hands tightened on the reins. Ahead of her on the trail, Caleb stopped his horse. Pryor's eyes moved to him, then to the wagon, then to the oilcloth package visible in the back. Mrs. Bennett, Pryor said pleasantly. Long way from home. We were just heading back, Lily said, keeping her voice completely neutral. That's so. Pryor walked his horse a step forward. I'm going to need whatever you picked up from old Pruitt up there. Surveying records if he gave you any. It's a legal matter. The materials are relevant to an ongoing dispute and need to be held pending review by no. The word came from Caleb flat and final, and Pryor's eyes snapped to him. I wasn't talking to you. You're blocking a public road, Caleb said. And you just tried to confiscate legal documents from a private citizen with no authority and no papers. So I'm talking to you. A pause. Move your horse. Pryor looked at the crutches propped against the saddle. He took his measure of the situation the way men like him always did, by looking at what he thought were the weaknesses in front of him. Big talk, Pryor said, for a man who can't stand up. Lily felt something go cold and electrical in the air. Caleb didn't move. His expression didn't change. His voice when it came was so calm and so certain that it was somehow more dangerous than anger. I've navigated mountain passes in the dark in a blizzard. I've moved 100 head of cattle through a flooded river crossing. I've tracked men in country that would have killed you in an afternoon." He looked at Pryor with a directness that was almost physical. "What exactly is it you think I'm afraid of?" Pryor opened his mouth. He closed it. The man behind him shifted in his saddle. Caleb turned his horse-controlled deliberate no haste, so that he was angled slightly toward Pryor's companion, which put him in a position that covered both men, and his hand rested on his thigh, very close to the revolver at his hip, in a way that was not a threat, but was absolutely a statement. The companion looked at Pryor. Pryor looked at Caleb. Whatever calculation he ran in those few seconds, it came out different than he'd expected. "This isn't over," Pryor said. "It is for today," Caleb said. "Move your horse." Pryor moved his horse. Lily drove the wagon through the gap without looking at either man, her spine straight, her face forward, the oilcloth package in the back of the wagon sitting between them like a declaration. She could feel both men watching. She could feel Caleb riding close behind her until they were 50 yards past the blockade, then 100, then around a bend in the road that put the timber between them and the two men on the ridge. She didn't stop. She didn't speak. She drove for another 10 minutes before the shaking in her hands got bad enough that she had to pull to the side and breathe. Caleb came alongside on the horse. He looked at her hands. He didn't say anything foolish about it. "You're all right," he said, and the way he said it was not a question or a reassurance. It was an observation made by someone who saw clearly. "You are all right. You did not break. You came through it." She pressed her hands flat on her knees. "I know," she breathed. The horses stood quiet. After a moment, she took the reins again. They rode the rest of the descent in silence, and the oilcloth package did not move in the wagon bed, and the mountain stood behind them all the way down, and Pryor did not follow. Not yet. But Lily knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had been underestimated by Harlan Dodd before that this was not the end of what he'd planned for her. Pruitt's ledger was the answer to Dodd's legal attack. It was not the answer to the man himself, a man who had a town council in his pocket, investors in Denver, and the patience of someone who had been acquiring land in this territory for a decade without being stopped once. They had won this round. The question that kept her company all the way back through the foothills was the one she hadn't let herself ask out loud. Yet what Dodd would try next, and whether the two of them, a widow and a mountain cowboy on a wagon road, a long way from home, would be ready for it when he did. They made it back to the Bennett Ranch on a Thursday evening road, tired and quieter than they'd started out, the oilcloth package riding behind them the whole way, like a promise. The Halverson boy had kept the cattle watered and the barn locked as she'd asked, and he was gone by the time they pulled in, and the ranch was exactly as they'd left it, except for one thing. Someone had been in the house. Lily knew it before she opened the door. A woman who has lived alone long enough develops a sense for the difference between a space that's empty and a space that's been touched. The kitchen chair was pulled out at the wrong angle. The lamp on the table had been moved 6 inches and not replaced exactly. Small things. Precise things. She stood in the doorway for a long moment. Behind her, she heard Caleb come up the porch steps on his crutches. "Don't go in." He stopped. She pushed the door fully open and looked at the kitchen. Really looked the way you look at a room you're reading instead of entering. Nothing was taken. Nothing was obviously disturbed. But the tin box where she kept Thomas's paperwork, the original deed, and the property records was sitting on the table instead of on the shelf where she kept it. They hadn't taken the papers. They'd read them. Whitmore. Caleb came in and looked at the tin box. His jaw tightened. "I was looking for gaps," he said. "Anything in the original deed they could use. Anything Thomas wrote that could be misread or misrepresented." "Did he find anything?" Caleb looked at the papers, then at her. "Did Thomas keep careful records?" Thomas kept every piece of paper he ever touched. She crossed to the tin box and checked through it quickly. Deed water rights, purchase agreement, correspondence with the territorial office receipts going back 6 years. All there. All in order. He was meticulous. Then no. Caleb leaned one crutch against the table and picked up the deed, scanning it. "Whitmore didn't find anything because there's nothing to find. This deed is clean. He set it down. But now they know that too, which means Dodd's pivoting. Pivoting to what? He looked at her steadily. Pressure. When you can't win legally, you make the other person too tired or too scared to keep fighting. Lily looked at the displaced lamp on the table, at the chair pulled out at the wrong angle, at all the small deliberate signs that someone had been inside her home, not to steal, but to remind her that they could. Something hardened in her chest that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was older than both of those things. It was the feeling she'd had standing at Thomas's grave in the cold April rain, the one she'd carried through 6 months of doing everything alone. The feeling of someone who has already lost the worst thing and found on the other side of it that they are still standing. Let him pivot, she said quietly. She put the lamp back where it belonged, set the chair straight, and went to put the coffee on. The next morning, she rode into Willow Creek with the oilcloth package under her arm, and Caleb beside her on the wagon, and she went directly to the office of the Territorial Land Registrar, a thin, bespectacled man named Greer, who had always struck her as someone who took the accuracy of records personally, the way some people take their religion personally. Greer took one look at Pruitt's ledger, and his eyebrows climbed his forehead and stayed there. This is the original field notes. Not a question. He turned the pages with the careful reverence of a man handling something he hadn't expected to see. With a sworn statement from the surveyor, Lily said, and placed Pruitt's written declaration on the desk beside the ledger. Greer read it. He read it twice. He looked up at her over his spectacles. Mrs. Bennett, the dispute filed by Mr. Dodd's representatives, claimed a measurement error on the western boundary, placing the creek outside your property line. These records. He touched the ledger lightly. Don't just dispute that claim, they demolish it. The original stakes. The measurements, the chain of custody on the survey. This is ironclad. What does that mean for the filing? It means I can move to have it dismissed. He sat back. It will take a week for the paperwork to go through the territorial office, but the outcome is not in question. Your deed stands, Mrs. Bennett. It always did. Lily breathed out slowly. Beside her, she felt Caleb go still in the particular way he went still when something resolved that he'd been holding tension around. And she did not look at him, because if she looked at him right now, she was going to do something embarrassing. A week? All right. I'll send notification to all parties as soon as it's processed. Greer capped his pen, including Mr. Dodd's office. She stood up. She shook his hand. She walked out of the land office into the morning air with the oilcloth package tucked under her arm, and the knowledge that the legal battle at least was effectively over. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let the sun hit her face. Then she heard the voice behind her, and her shoulders tightened before she'd fully registered who it was. Mrs. Bennett. Harlan Dodd's voice was the particular brand of smooth that cost him nothing. He materialized from the direction of the bank, like he'd been waiting, which he probably had. His eyes went briefly dismissively to Caleb beside her. Back from your travels, I see. Mr. Dodd. I heard you'd taken a little trip. He smiled. Long way to go for nothing. We went to visit Asa Pruitt, she said, keeping her voice pleasant. He sends his regards, along with his original survey ledger and a sworn statement to the territorial office. She paused. Greer's filing the dismissal today. Something moved in Dodd's face. It happened fast, a small contraction there and gone, but she caught it. Caleb caught it too. She could tell by the way he was watching Dodd with the focused stillness of a man tracking a thing that might bolt. Well, Dodd said, and his voice had shifted slightly, something smoother layered over something harder. The law has its process. I respect that. I'm sure you do. The land itself, though. He spread his hands in a gesture of perfect false helplessness. That's a different matter, isn't it? Running a working ranch, keeping it profitable in this climate, that's not a legal question. That's a practical one. And I wonder sometimes, Mrs. Bennett, whether pride is worth the price. There it was. The real message delivered in the language of concern. Lily looked at him. Mr. Dodd, I wonder sometimes whether you understand that there are things in this world that aren't for sale. She picked up the package. Good morning. She turned away. She did not look back. Dodd's voice followed her quieter now, meant for her ears only. That ranch will break you before winter. She kept walking, but she heard it. She carried it with her the rest of the day, the way you carry a stone in your boot, small, constant, impossible to ignore. Because the cruelest thing about Dodd's parting words was not that they were designed to frighten her. It was that they were partly true. The legal battle was won. The ranch was still in trouble. 17 head of cattle was not a viable operation. The roof leaked in 3 places that were getting worse. The water trough repair Caleb had done was solid, but the irrigation channel that fed it from the creek was silting up and would need to be cleared before the dry season hit, which was 6 weeks away. She had $38 left. She had no help except one man on 2 crutches. She laid it all out on the kitchen table that evening. The numbers, the timeline, the list of what needed doing and what it would cost. She didn't do it for Caleb. She did it for herself the way she always worked through hard things, by making them visible, by refusing to let them live, only in the dark part of her mind, where they grew larger than they were. Caleb came in from checking the barn and stopped at the edge of the table. He looked at the list. He sat down. I didn't say anything comforting. She did not want anything comforting, and he seemed to know it. He studied the list the way he studied terrain, reading it for what it was, not what he wished it were. The irrigation channel, he said finally. That's the priority. I know. Without it, you lose water pressure to the trough by August. Cattle can't sustain on hand carrying in the heat. I know, Caleb. It's 3 days of work if done right. Maybe 2 if... He stopped. She looked up from the list. If what? He was quiet for a moment, and she had learned to read his silences by now. This one was the kind where he was calculating something he wasn't sure she'd accept. If I can get in the channel. Seated work. I can clear silt and reset the grade from a seated position if the trench is dug out wide enough. It's not fast, but it's correct. She looked at him. That's hard work. Most work is. Caleb, don't. His voice was flat, but not unkind. Don't tell me what I can't do based on how I look doing it. You've had 6 months of people telling you what you can't manage on your own. How'd that feel? The question sat between them, blunt and exact. She looked back at the list. 2 days. We start tomorrow. He nodded once. He reached across the table and turned the list so he could read the rest of it. They worked through the numbers for another hour, and outside the night came in quiet over the ranch, and neither of them said anything more about Dodd or winter or the $38, because there was nothing more to say about any of it tonight. Tonight was for planning what came next. Worry was a luxury, and they had work to do. The irrigation channel took 3 days, not 2. And every one of those days was the kind of hard that lives in your muscles for a week after. Lily dug. Caleb directed and cleared from inside the channel, seated at the edge, working with his arms and the tools she handed him, resetting the grade stones with a precision she couldn't have matched because she didn't have his eye for the angle of water flow. They didn't talk much while they worked. They didn't need to. They had developed, without discussing it, without naming it, a working rhythm that was almost eerie in its efficiency. She would start a task, he would identify the problem in it, she would adjust, he would execute what she couldn't reach, and the work moved forward. On the second afternoon, Hector Halverson, father of the boy who'd watched the cattle, came by to return a fence tool he'd borrowed from Thomas a year ago and never gotten around to bringing back. He stood at the edge of the channel and watched them work for a full minute before he said anything. Need an extra hand? Lily straightened up and looked at him. Hector Halverson was a big, weathered man in his 50s who had known Thomas since before she'd married him. He'd been polite to her since the funeral. Not helpful, not unhelpful polite. I won't turn it down, she said carefully. He nodded and took off his coat and got in the channel. I didn't say anything to Caleb at first, just worked. But after an hour, when they stopped to drink water and let their arms rest, Halverson looked at Caleb across the channel and said, That grade reset on the north segment, that's right. I wouldn't have gotten that angle. Caleb looked at him. You have to account for the soil compression in spring. If you set it flat now, it'll shift low by March and backflood the trough. Halverson nodded slowly, the nod of one practical man acknowledging another. You know water. I know mountains. Same thing mostly. Something shifted in Halverson's face. Not dramatically, this was a frontier man. They didn't do things dramatically, but it was there. A reassessment. A small, quiet revision of whatever he'd thought when he'd first seen Caleb Anderson sitting in the dirt of an irrigation channel with two crutches propped on the bank. He came back the next morning. He brought his oldest son. Lily didn't say anything about it. She just put more food on at breakfast and went back out to work. The channel was done by Thursday. The trough was running clean and strong by Thursday afternoon. Lily stood and watched the water moving through the reset grade and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. The particular satisfaction of a problem solved by hands, by thought, by the refusal to give up on it. She heard footsteps behind her. Halverson's, and then his voice careful, like he was feeling the edge of something. Dodd's been talking. She kept her eyes on the water. Dodd's always talking. This is different. A pause. He's been going around to the small ranchers south of here, talking about consolidation, investment opportunity, using the language about development and water rights and how individual operations can't compete with what's coming. Another pause. He's offering buyouts, not just you, everyone. Lily turned around slowly. Halverson was watching her with the careful look of a man who had made a calculation and come out on a side. How many have taken the offer? She asked. Stokes, Kerrigan. He hesitated. Maybe Prudhomme, I'm not sure yet. 3 of the 6 small ranchers south of her property. If Dodd acquired those 3, he'd have the eastern water approach to the valley and enough landmass to make the argument that the Bennett Ranch was the last piece he needed to complete a viable large-scale operation. How was building a case not just in legal offices, but on the actual ground purchasing leverage, one small operation at a time, until saying no to him meant being surrounded. It was elegant in the way that cold-blooded things are elegant. He doesn't need my land for water anymore, Lily said slowly, working through it. He needs it for access. If he controls the eastern ranches and the western road, my property is the corridor. Halverson looked at her. That's about the size of it. She looked at the irrigation channel, at the water running clean through it, at the 3 days of work that were now in the larger picture, a single small victory in a much larger war. Inside the barn, she could hear Caleb, the rhythm of his work, whatever he'd taken on in there, while she was outside, the steady, purposeful sound of it. What do you need? Halverson asked. She looked at him surprised. Not by the question, but by the directness of it, by the fact that he was asking it at all. Time. And information. Who's still holding out? McGrath is, Halverson said. And old Danforth. And me. He paused again, and she understood that the pause was its own answer, that Halverson had already decided something before he'd come to tell her any of this. Dodd came to me 2 weeks ago. I said no. Lily held that for a moment. Hector. Why? He looked at the channel. At the work they'd done together over 3 days. Because Thomas was my friend for 20 years, and I stood at his grave and told him I was sorry, and did nothing about it for 6 months. His voice was gruff and quiet. And because I watched a man on crutches reset a water grade better than I could have done it standing on 2 good legs, and it made me think I'd been assessing things wrong. She didn't say anything. It was not the moment for words. Halverson put his hat back on. I'll talk to McGrath and Danforth. We should meet, all of us, before Dodd gets to anyone else. He left. Lily stood at the edge of the channel for a while longer, and then she went to find Caleb. Hal was in the barn, and he had clearly been listening. The barn wall backed onto where she'd been standing with Halverson, and the window was open, and Caleb Anderson had spent years on trails where the difference between knowing what was coming and not knowing it was the difference between arriving and not arriving. He did not pretend he hadn't heard. Dodd's flanking us, he said before she'd finished crossing the floor. Yes. He doesn't need to win the legal fight if he can make the land economically useless. Isolate the property, control access to market roads, make it impossible to move cattle or supplies without going through territory he owns. He set down the tool he'd been holding. It's a siege, a slow one. She sat down on the nearest hay bale because her legs were tired and she was done pretending they weren't. Can we stop it? He looked at her for a moment. Not alone. Halverson's in. McGrath and Danforth might be. We need more than ranchers. We need someone with standing in the territorial capital. Someone who can put Dodd's acquisition pattern in front of the right officials and frame it as what it is. Monopolization of water access, which is a territorial violation. He stopped. I know someone. She looked up. Judge Warren Ells. Retired. Lives in Laramie. He's the man who wrote the original water rights framework for this territory in 1873. If anyone can look at what Dodd is building and name it correctly in language that matters, it's Ells. Do you know him personally? I guided him on 3 hunting trips in the mountains. He's a straight man. Stubborn. He doesn't like land consolidation as a legal principle, thinks it corrupts local governance. A pause. He'll listen to me. Lily looked at him across the barn, at the man who had been deposited on her porch like something nobody wanted, who 2 months later was naming retired territorial judges who owed him favors and talking about water rights frameworks and Dodd's consolidation strategy with the same calm authority he brought to everything else. Caleb. Yeah. Why are you doing this? The question surprised him. She could tell by the slight pause the way he looked away briefly at the barn wall before looking back. It's the right thing. That's not a full answer. He was quiet for a moment, and she waited, and she had learned that with Caleb, you did not fill his silences for him. Because Dodd is exactly the kind of man who has always been able to take things from people like you, he said finally. Because people like you are usually alone when it matters. And because... He stopped, looked at his hands. Because this is the first place in 2 years where I've been useful, where what I know has mattered. And I find I'm not ready to let Dodd take that from me either. The barn went quiet. Outside, the late afternoon was settling, and the cattle were calm, and the water was running through the fixed irrigation channel, and 2 months of careful distance had arrived, either of them planning it at something that felt terrifyingly like honesty. Lily looked at him for a long moment. Right to Ells. Tonight. He nodded. She stood up and she walked past him toward the barn door, and she stopped just at the threshold without turning around. Caleb. Her voice was quiet. For what it's worth, you've been useful from the first morning. She walked out. Behind her in the barn, there was a long silence. The letter went out the next morning, and Lily spent the day doing what she was good at, moving pieces, assessing positions, refusing to be still. She rode to McGrath's place in the afternoon and found a rancher who was angrier than she'd expected, and angrier, it turned out, was useful. McGrath had already turned down Dodd twice and was looking for a reason to do more than say no. When she told him about Pruitt's ledger and the dismissed land dispute and the letter to Judge Ells, something in McGrath's eyes went from defensive to considering. If Ells weighs in, McGrath said, Dodd loses his political cover. The council here supports him because there's no authority over them saying it's wrong. That's the idea, Lily said. And if the other ranchers hold, they need to hold. Dodd's buying time as much as land. Every week he gets another property, the picture he's painting looks more complete. Every week we hold it looks more like resistance. McGrath looked at her across the fence line between their properties. When did you become a tactician, Mrs. Bennett? She thought about the man she'd left at the ranch writing a letter to a retired judge by lamplight, with the same focused precision he brought to everything. I had help thinking it through. It was 3 days later when Dodd made his next move, and it was the one she hadn't anticipated. He didn't go after the land, he went after Caleb. He sent a man not prior. This time, someone she'd never seen before. Well-dressed, friendly-looking, to the ranch on a Wednesday morning when Lily had ridden to Halverson's place for their planned meeting, and Caleb was alone. She came back to find Caleb sitting at the kitchen table with a folded document in front of him, and an expression she couldn't immediately read. She sat down. What is it? He slid the document to her. It was an offer. Not for the ranch, for Caleb himself. A position well paid in Denver. A consultant's role with the Denver Land Investment Group that Dodd was representing. Trail guidance, terrain assessment, mountain mapping for new operations. Good money. The kind of money that would have been life-changing 18 months ago. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, a personal note. Given your current circumstances, this represents an opportunity to restore your independence and financial standing. We hope you'll consider it seriously. Lily read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at him. He was watching her. He wants to remove you. Yes. If you go to Denver, I have no one who knows what Dodd's doing. No connections to Pruitt to Els to the legal framework. No one who can read his strategy before it lands. Yes. She looked at the offer again. At the money. At the words "restore your independence." Which was not a job offer, but a targeted message to a man who had been stripped of the things that defined him, delivered by someone who had done his research. That's well crafted. Dodd didn't write it, Caleb said. Whitmore did. He's the one who understands people. Are you tempted? The question came out before she'd decided to ask it direct and unguarded in a way she hadn't intended. She held very still, waiting. Caleb looked at her for a moment. At the table between them. At the document. 2 months ago, he said slowly. I might have been. 2 months ago, I was a man sitting in a back room waiting for time to move. A pause. I'm not that man anymore. Lily didn't move. What are you now? She asked, quieter. He met her eyes. I'm a man with something worth defending. The kitchen was very still. She picked up the document and held it over the lamp on the table until it caught, and she held it there until it was ash in the tray, and neither of them looked away from the other. Outside, a horse came up the road faster than a casual caller, and both of them registered it at the same moment, and the stillness broke. Lily went to the window. It was the Halverson boy riding hard, his face flushed from effort, and she had the door open before he'd fully stopped the horse. Mrs. Bennett. He was breathing fast. Mr. Halverson sent me. Dodd called a town meeting tonight, 7 o'clock at the council hall. He's putting something to a vote. She went cold. What vote? Something about public road access, rerouting the South Road. The boy swallowed. If the vote passed, the only wagon road to your property runs through land. Dodd already bought from Stokes. He'd control who can deliver to you and who can't. She turned and looked at Caleb. He was already reaching for his crutches. We have 4 hours. 4 hours to get to McGrath and Danforth and Halverson. 4 hours to walk into that council room with enough people and enough standing to turn a rigged vote into a contested one. 4 hours to make sure that when Harlan Dodd stood up in front of Willow Creek and tried to finish what he'd been building all summer, he found something he had not once in this entire campaign genuinely prepared for. Opposition. Organized, clear-eyed, and done waiting for him to show mercy. That was what they needed to walk into that council hall, and they had 4 hours to build it from nothing. Lily was already moving before the Halverson boy had turned his horse around. She went to the bedroom and came back with Thomas's old saddlebag, the one she used when she needed to ride fast, and she was pulling her coat off the hook by the door when Caleb's voice stopped her. Split up. You take McGrath. I'll send word to Danforth through the boy. She looked at him. You're coming tonight. Obviously. The council hall, the entrance steps are steep. I know what the steps look like. His voice was patient and immovable. I've been up worse. Go get McGrath. She went. She rode hard to McGrath's place and found him already saddling up. Halverson had gotten to him first, 20 minutes ahead of her and McGrath's face. When he saw her, had the look of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment without knowing he was waiting for it. What do you need from me? He asked, not wasting a word. I need you in that room. I need Danforth if you can reach him. And I need you to talk to every man in Willow Creek who has ever done business with me or Thomas, and remind them that what Dodd does to my road access tonight, he can do to theirs next month. McGrath looked at her for a long moment, his hand resting on the saddle horn. You've changed. Not an accusation, an observation. She took the reins. Get Danforth. She turned the horse and rode back toward town. The council hall was already filling when she arrived, which told her Dodd had done his own preparation. He'd spent the last several days making sure the right people were in that room tonight. The people who would vote yes, without asking why. The people who believed Harlan Dodd when he talked about progress and investment and the future of the region. She recognized faces as she moved through the crowd. Some of them met her eyes. Some of them looked away. She found a place along the side wall and watched the room fill and counted. McGrath came in at 20 minutes to 7 with Danforth at his shoulder. Halverson was already there in the third row with two of his neighbors from the South Road. She caught Halverson's eye across the room. He gave one brief nod. 7 o'clock. 6 votes to counter whatever Dodd had arranged. Maybe 7 if the man she'd seen Halverson speaking to on his way in was who she thought he was. She needed more. The door opened again, and she felt the room shift before she saw why that particular change in energy when something unexpected enters. She turned. Caleb was in the doorway. He had come on his crutches through the evening streets of a town that had spent 2 years either pitying him or pretending he didn't exist, and he had climbed the steps of the council hall. However, he'd managed it. She did not ask, and would not, and he stood in the doorway with the easy, settled authority of a man who had decided where he was going to be tonight, and nothing was going to change that. The room did not go silent, but it shifted. She felt it, a kind of collective adjustment. People recalibrating the way you recalibrate when a thing you thought was fixed turns out to be moving. Dodd was already at the front of the room talking to 2 council members, and he turned at the shift in the room's energy and saw Caleb. Something crossed his face, not fear, not yet, but the look of a man whose calculation has just developed an unexpected variable. Caleb moved through the room. People stepped aside, not out of pity, but out of something else, the instinct that makes way for a person who knows exactly where they're going. He found a position along the wall across from Lily and settled there, his eyes moving over the crowd with the same systematic attention he gave to everything, reading the room the way he read terrain. He caught her eye across the hall. She gave him the same brief nod Halverson had given her. He looked back at the front of the room. The meeting opened at 7:05. Councilman Garrett, presiding, a round-faced man who had been in Dodd's pocket for 3 years and knew it and had made his peace with it. He called the room to order and explained the proposal in the language of civic improvement, the same language Dodd used for everything efficiency development, the long-term benefit of the community. The South Road rerouting, he explained, was a matter of practical infrastructure. The current road alignment was inefficient. The proposed reroute would better serve the majority of road users while accommodating the region's growing development needs. Nothing in that language mentioned Lily Bennett. Nothing mentioned the fact that the rerouted road would pass through land Dodd had purchased 30 days ago. Nothing mentioned that the only wagon access to the Bennett Ranch would then require passing through a gate that Dodd controlled. The language was very clean. The intention underneath it was not. Garrett called for initial comments. Dodd spoke first. Of course, standing up with his thumbs in his vest pockets and talking for 4 minutes in the warm, confident voice of a man who believes the room belongs to him. Progress. Development. The needs of the many. The future of Willow Creek. He did not look at Lily once. Then he sat down and looked at Garrett, and Garrett was about to move toward the vote, and Lily stepped forward from the wall. "I'd like to speak." The room went quieter than it had been. Garrett looked at her, then at Dodd, then back at her, and nodded. She walked to the center of the room, and she stood where everyone could see her, and she had one chance to say this. Right, so she took a breath and she said it as plainly as she knew how. What's being proposed tonight is not road improvement. It's a lock. She let that sit for one breath. In the last 2 months, Harlan Dodd has filed a fraudulent land dispute against my property, had his representative break into my home, sent a man to intercept legal documents on a public road, and purchased 3 neighboring properties in a deliberate pattern designed to isolate my ranch from market access and water rights. Tonight's vote is the final piece. She looked around the room, not at Dodd, at the people. If this passes, he controls whether I can move cattle to market, whether supplies can reach my property, whether I survive the winter. She paused. And after me, whoever he decides to acquire next. The room was very still. She looked at McGrath, at Halverson, at Danforth's weathered face in the 4th row. "I'm asking you to vote no. Not just for me, for yourselves. Because the man standing at the front of this room does not stop. She walked back to the wall. The room was not silent. It was the specific charged non-silence of a crowd processing something. She could hear it, feel it, the recalibration happening in real time. Several people who had come in already decided looked less decided. Dodd stood up again. His voice was still smooth, but it had taken on an edge. Mrs. Bennet is understandably emotional about her situation, he began, and the condescension in those words was so precisely targeted that Lily felt it like a slap. But the question before this council is a practical infrastructure matter, not a personal grievance. Mr. Dodd. The voice came from across the room, and it was Caleb's, not loud, but with a quality of absolute steadiness that cut through the ambient noise of the crowd, the way a rifle shot cuts through wind. Every head in the room turned. Caleb pushed off the wall and moved to the center of the room, and the crowd parted for him without being asked, and he stopped in the space where Lily had stood 20 seconds ago. I guided trails in this territory for 6 years, he said, speaking to the room, not to Dodd specifically, though his eyes tracked Dodd the entire time. I know every water source, every access road, every property boundary between here and the Clearwater Range. And I know something about what Mr. Dodd has been building in this valley because I helped Asa Pruitt survey half of it 14 years ago. He stopped. The road Dodd wants you to reroute tonight runs along the northern edge of what was the Stokes property, which Dodd purchased 6 weeks ago, and which happens to sit directly between the Bennett Ranch and the only viable route to the Cheyenne Market Road. He looked at this council table. You're not voting on a road. You're voting on whether one man gets to decide who succeeds and who fails in this valley. Garrett shifted in his chair. Mr. Anderson, the council has not recognized you to speak. Let him finish. McGrath's voice from the third row. Not a request. A beat of silence. Garrett looked at Dodd. Dodd's expression was controlled, but his eyes had gone cold. Let him finish, someone else said. Then another voice. Then a fourth. Garrett subsided. Caleb looked at the room. I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the map. He reached into his coat and took out a folded document. She recognized it, the copy of Pruitt's survey. She hadn't thought to ask him what he'd done with, and held it up. Every acquisition Dodd has made in the last 8 months is marked. Every one of them is a piece of a corridor. When they're assembled, he owns the approach to every water source in the South Valley. This road vote is the last piece. After tonight, he doesn't need to buy Mrs. Bennett's land. He just needs to wait. He set the document on the nearest desk and stepped back. The room erupted. Not violently, this was a town hall, not a bar room, but in the specific chaotic way of a crowd that has just been told something it believed was secret and is processing it in real time. 3 conversations started at once. Garrett banged his gavel and achieved nothing. Dodd was on his feet, his voice cutting through the noise, talking about misrepresentation and slander and the proper process for vote. Halverson's voice flat and clear. Call the vote. The council will determine the timing, Garrett started. Call the vote, Halverson said again. Around him, others picked it up. The word moved through the room like a current. Garrett looked at Dodd one more time. Dodd gave a tiny, precise shake of his head. Not now, not tonight, too much noise. And that was when Lily saw it. The retreat. Not defeat. Not yet. Dodd was too practiced for that, but the recognition that this room had shifted past the point where the vote would go, the way he'd arranged it. The council will table this proposal for further review, Garrett announced, and the gavel came down, and the crowd erupted again, louder this time. Half protest and half something else. The particular noise of people who came in ready to approve something and are leaving uncertain. Tabled was not defeated. Lily knew that. Dodd knew that. He caught her eye across the room for the first time all evening, and in his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not warmth, never warmth, but a kind of acknowledgement. The look one chess player gives another when a piece moves unexpectedly. She held his gaze without blinking. He turned and walked out. The crowd thinned slowly. McGrath shook her hand. Danforth, a man of almost no words, put a hand briefly on her shoulder and walked out. Halverson stopped beside her long enough to say, "Well done." in a tone that made it clear he meant both of them, and then he too was gone. She found Caleb near the door, waiting for the crowd to clear enough to move through it comfortably. He was looking at the document on the desk. Someone had moved it, tried to read it, left it half unfolded. He reached over and folded it back up without looking at her. Tabled. Yes. Not dead. No. He tucked the document inside his coat. Dodd will regroup. He'll come back with a cleaner proposal, something harder to argue with publicly. He'll wait until the room is less charged. Caleb. She touched his arm just briefly, just the lightest contact. He stopped. Tonight was a victory. He looked at her. Yes. It was. Let it be a victory for 5 minutes before we plan the next battle. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. The expression of a man who is remembering something about how to be a person, rather than just a strategy. 5 minutes, he agreed. They walked out of the council hall together, and the night air was cool, and the street was mostly empty, and the town of Willow Creek lay quiet around them, with all its complications and histories and small cruelties intact, but different slightly than it had been 3 hours ago. Different in the way that rooms are different after something is said in them that can't be unsaid. 3 days later, the letter came from Laramie. Judge Warren Ells, retired, wrote in a hand that was still precise and confident at 70 years old, and his letter was 4 pages long and left nothing unclear. He had reviewed the land acquisition pattern Caleb had described, cross-referenced it with the territorial water rights legislation he himself had written, and his conclusion was stated in the second paragraph. Without preamble, what Dodd was doing constituted a deliberate monopolization of water access, in violation of the 1873 Territorial Land and Water Use Act, and the appropriate response was a formal investigation by the Territorial Governor's Office. He had already sent a copy to the governor. He had also, he noted at the end of the letter, enclosed a personal note for Caleb Anderson, which he expected Caleb to read without excessive stubbornness. Lily handed Caleb his envelope without reading it. She sat at the kitchen table with the judge's letter and read it twice very carefully, and by the time she set it down, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in. She couldn't calculate how long. Not relief, not yet. Relief required the thing to actually be over. But the solid weight-bearing feeling of ground under her feet, after a long time of not being sure it was there. "What does the judge say?" she asked. Caleb was reading his letter, and she watched his face while he did the slight shift of expression that moved through it. Something that might have been in another man the moment before tears, but was in him the moment before very great stillness. He folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "He says to stop being an idiot and come visit him in Laramie when this is settled." A pause. "He says other things too." She waited. "He says he heard what happened on the mountain, the rock slide." Caleb's voice was even, but she could hear the effort in the evenness. "He says a man who pushed another man out of the path of falling rock, and then spent 2 years believing he was useless, is in need of significant recalibration." Lily looked at her coffee cup. "Smart man. Infuriating man," Caleb said. "Always was." She looked up at him. He was still looking at the pocket where he'd put the letter. "Caleb, the rock slide. You've never—" She stopped, started again. "You don't have to tell me, but I want you to know that I've wondered." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he'd chosen not to answer. "His name was Pete Drayson," he said finally. 22 years old. First season guiding. The trail gave way faster than I saw it coming before he did." A pause. "I don't know why I'm still here, and my legs aren't right, and Pete is fine, and living in Colorado running a horse operation. I've spent 2 years trying to figure out if there's an answer to that." He stopped. "There isn't." "No," she said quietly. "There isn't." "So I stopped looking for one." She looked at him across the table, at the man who had arrived on her porch, with nothing but pride and pain, and the complete refusal to be pitied, who had fixed her harness, and her water trough, and her irrigation channel, and stood up in a room full of people who'd written him off, and been the most authoritative voice in it, and she thought about all the ways she'd misjudged him in those first days, and all the ways she hadn't. Pete Drayson got to walk away. You got to stay. Something in him shifted. She felt it across the table. Lily, I don't mean it as comfort. I mean it as fact. You stayed. And everything you've done from that porch step to tonight, that's what staying looks like. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then the sound of a horse outside broke through the quiet, and she turned toward the window, and her stomach tightened again because it was Pryor. Pryor in daylight, which was different from Pryor on a mountain road. Daylight made him official in a way the road had not. He came up to the door and knocked, and Lily opened it, and he was holding a document she recognized as territorial in origin by the seal. Mrs. Bennett. His voice had lost the easy threat of the mountain road and replaced it with something more careful. I have a formal communication from the Denver Investment Group authorized by... Is it a new offer? She asked. He stopped. Yes, ma'am. For what? For the ranch. A pause. A fair offer. Above market value. She looked at the document. She did not take it. Why? She asked. He blinked. Ma'am. Why now? Why this week after the council meeting after the governor's office has opened an inquiry into Mr. Dodd's land acquisitions in this territory? She kept her voice completely pleasant. Why is the offer above market value? Pryor's jaw tightened. She hadn't known about the governor's inquiry being public yet. She'd guessed based on Elsa's letter, based on the timing of Pryor's appearance, and she'd guessed right because Pryor's reaction confirmed it before he'd said a word. It's a legitimate business offer. Nothing more. Tell Mr. Dodd thank you, Lily said. The answer is no. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it for a moment, breathing. From the kitchen, Caleb's voice. He's spooked. She came back to the table and sat down. The inquiry. Els moved faster than I expected. Els doesn't believe in slow when he's certain. Caleb had his hands around his coffee cup, leaning forward slightly, thinking. This is good. This is very good. But Dodd is going to do something impulsive now, and impulsive is actually more dangerous than calculated. When a man like him loses the high ground, he doesn't retreat, he overreaches. She felt the truth of that in her chest. What will he do? I don't know exactly. Caleb looked up at her. But I know it'll come at you directly this time. Not the land, not the road, you. He held her gaze. He'll try to make you personally lose something. The words settled over her like cold water. My cattle, she said immediately, because that was the most vulnerable thing. The cattle were her income, her operation, the living proof that the ranch was viable. Caleb nodded slowly. When? She asked. If he's moving fast soon, this week. She stood up and she was already thinking through it, already seeing the steps. And then something stopped her. A sound from outside that she placed after a single second. As wrong, the wrong kind of sound. The silence that follows something, and she was at the window before she'd consciously decided to move. The south pasture gate was open, not ajar. Open. Wide, fully, deliberately open. And the cattle that had been in the south pasture were not in the south pasture anymore. Caleb. Her voice came out very quiet. They moved the cattle. She heard him behind her moving fast, and she was already going for her coat and the rifle and the door, and the evening was coming in purple dark around the ranch, and 17 head of cattle were somewhere on the open land south of her fence line, with no one to turn them back until morning. She got outside and stopped at the edge of the porch, reading the tracks in the fading light, the way Caleb had taught her, not by explaining it, just by doing it in front of her, until she started to see what he saw. 2 horses, Caleb said from behind her, reading the same ground, came in from the east, left through the gap in the draw. He was already scanning the terrain to the south. They're not gone far. Cattle don't run unless they're pushed, and they wouldn't push them far. That's not the point. The point is the effort, getting them back in the dark. I can ride south now, start turning them. You'll ride in circles in the dark and exhaust yourself and the horse. He said it flat, not unkind. The cattle will drift to water by morning. They know this land. You go at first light, you'll find them inside 2 hours. She stood on the porch in the dark with her hands clenched at her sides, and she knew he was right. And knowing he was right while Dodd's men were out there in the territory she'd fought for all summer was one of the hardest things she'd had to do yet. He wants me to panic. Yes. He wants me to make mistakes. Yes. She unclenched her hands. She breathed. First light. First light, he agreed. She turned back toward the house and he was standing in the doorway with the lamp behind him, and she stopped in front of him closer than she usually stood, because the porch was narrow and the night was dark, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to her foundation. We're going to get through this. Not to him, or not only to him. To herself in his presence, which was a different thing and somehow felt right. Yes. We are. She went inside. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer, looking south at the land where the cattle had gone, at the dark hills that held them at the country they had been fighting for together since the summer began. Then the lamplight caught his face, and he turned away from the dark and went inside to plan the morning. Morning came gray and cold, and Lily was on her horse before full light, and she found the cattle in 2 hours and 10 minutes. Caleb had been right about the water, right about the drift, right about everything, and she brought them back through the gate and fixed the latch with a new iron pin that nobody was going to be opening quietly in the dark again. Halverson came by at noon and brought a saddle roll of fence wire without being asked, and while he helped her reinforce the south gate, he told her that 2 more ranchers who had been considering Dodd's offer had in the last 48 hours decided not to take it. The governor's inquiry was public now. Word had moved through the territory the way word moves fast along lines of mutual interest. People who had been considering Dodd's offers were reconsidering. People who had already sold were talking to lawyers about what the inquiry might mean for their agreements. Dodd had not left Willow Creek. His man Pryor was still in town. Whitmore was still in town. But the architecture they'd built all summer, the careful, patient acquisition of leverage, was cracking. Not broken, not yet, but cracking. Lily stood at the south gate after Halverson left and looked at the cattle in the pasture at the fence line that held them at the land. Thomas had broken with his hands and she had nearly lost and hadn't. She heard Caleb come up beside her, the sound she'd grown so accustomed to that she registered it now the way she registered the sound of the wind or the creek, simply as part of the world she was living in. Els wrote again. She looked at him. He was holding a second letter she hadn't seen arrive. The territorial governor's office is dispatching an agent to Willow Creek to review the acquisition pattern and interview relevant parties. He paused. Dodd will be interviewed. Lily turned back to the pasture. The cattle were grazing calm and ordinary, exactly where they were supposed to be. When? She asked. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She had survived everything Dodd had thrown at them since July. She had 14 more days to hold the line. She looked at the land, at the creek glinting in the afternoon, at everything Thomas had built, and she had fought for, and Caleb had helped her keep. 2 weeks, and somewhere in the town. 3 miles down the road, Harlan Dodd was reading the same letter and making the same calculation, and arriving, she was certain of it. Bone certain, at the conclusion that he had 2 weeks to do the one thing he had never yet tried. Come at them with everything at once, and that was exactly what Harlan Dodd did, and he did it on a Tuesday, 9 days before the territorial agent was due to arrive at 4 in the morning when the world was dark, and most people were still trusting the night to hold. Lily smelled it before she heard it. Smoke. She was out of bed, and at the window in 3 seconds. And what she saw turned her blood to ice water. The barn was on fire, not catching, not smoldering, but fully deliberately burning, the kind of fire that has been helped along, and in the orange light, she could see the shapes of her cattle against the fence line of the south pasture, pressing against it terrified, and the fence was the only thing between them and the open territory. She was through the back door before she had boots fully on, screaming Caleb's name at the top of her lungs. He was already up. She didn't ask how he'd woken. She never found out whether he'd smelled it too or heard something she hadn't. But he was up and dressed and moving, and she saw immediately that he was thinking faster than the panic in her chest was letting her think. "Cattle first," he said. "Get them north. The barn is gone. Don't waste a second on it." She ran for the south pasture gate. He went for the water barrel at the side of the house, not to fight the fire. The fire was past fighting, but she didn't understand why until she was already moving, and later she would realize he'd been thinking about the fence line and the sparks and the dry grass between the barn and the north pasture, thinking 3 steps ahead while she was still reacting to the step she was on. She got the south gate open and drove the cattle north with her voice and her arms, and they moved panicked and pressing, and she moved with them and kept them moving, kept them pointed north, kept herself between them and the fence line until she had all 17 through the north gate, and the gate latched behind them, and the herd pressed together against the far fence, frightened but contained. She turned back to the barn. It was gone. Not going gone. The structure was fully involved, and there was nothing to save, and she stood 30 feet from it, with the heat pushing against her face, and she made herself look at it and accept it. The tools. The winter feed she'd laid in. The tack she and Caleb had repaired piece by piece over 3 months. Gone. Caleb was at the water barrel, and he'd done what she hadn't understood. He'd soaked the fence posts between the barn and the house, the ones closest to the fire, the ones that would have carried the blaze to the house if they'd caught. The house was stone-footed. It would hold. She walked to where he was standing, and she looked at the fire, and she didn't say anything for a long moment. "All 17, he asked. "All 17. He nodded. They stood together and watched the barn burn down, and there was nothing else to do. Halverson arrived at dawn. She did not know how he knew, but he arrived, and behind him was McGrath on horseback and the Halverson boy and 2 men she recognized from the council meeting. They stood at the edge of the ruins, and no one said the word arson out loud, but every face in that group said it without words. McGrath crouched and looked at the base of the burn. He stood up and looked at Lily. "Accelerant," he said. 1 word. All the accusation the situation required. Halverson had his hat in his hands. "I'm going to town." "Hector," she started. "I'm going to town," he said again, with the flat finality of a man who has made a decision and will not be redirected. "Dodd was at the saloon last night until 10 o'clock. I was there. I saw him. So were 4 other men I can name. But Pryor was not there, and Whitmore was not there." He put his hat back on. "Someone needs to say that to Sheriff Baines this morning, before Dodd has time to arrange what he'll say about where Pryor was last night." She looked at him. In 6 months of being Thomas's widow in this town, Hector Halverson had been polite and present and useless. 3 months of Caleb Anderson working a channel beside him had turned him into something she hadn't anticipated, an ally with both conviction and a plan. "Go," she said. He went. McGrath stayed. His men stayed. Nobody asked if they should. They simply stayed, moving around the ruins, checking the fence line, making themselves necessary in the quiet way of people who have decided which side of something they're on. Caleb was at the edge of the ruins, studying the burn pattern. He was doing it the way he did everything, methodically, without drama, reading the information. She came to stand beside him. "Where did it start?" she asked. "East wall, near the base." He pointed without looking up. Someone who knew what they were doing. Fast, clean ignition. They wanted the structure, not the cattle. If they wanted the cattle, they'd have opened the gate first. He paused. This was about the barn, about the feed, about making winter impossible. She looked at the ruins. 40 years of Thomas's tools. 3 months of her and Caleb's work. Gone in 4 hours. "Can we rebuild before winter?" she asked. He looked at her then, and what was in his face was not false comfort, but genuine calculation. The mountain guide, running the numbers, the man who had learned to assess hard situations without lying about them. "If we start this week," he said. "If Halverson and McGrath help. If the timber order goes out today." He stopped. "It'll be close." "Close is enough," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Yes," he agreed. "It is." Sheriff Baines came to the ranch at 9 that morning, and he was not the corrupt official Dodd might have preferred. He was a deliberate, methodical man who had been sheriff for 11 years and had survived in that role by never visibly choosing sides, even when he privately had one. He walked the burn site. He looked at what McGrath had found. He wrote things in his notebook with the careful attention of a man building a record. Pryor was seen leaving the Lucky Star at 9:30 last night, Baines said, not looking up from his notes. He had a room at the hotel. As of this morning, his room is empty, and his horse is gone. Lily looked at him. Gone where? That's what I intend to find out. He closed his notebook. Mrs. Bennett, I need to be direct with you. I can open an investigation. The evidence supports it. But Dodd is going to deny knowledge. Pryor is gone, and without a witness who saw the act, the investigation may not produce what you need. What do I need? She asked. Baines looked at her steadily. The territorial agent arrives in 9 days. What you need is to still be standing when he gets here. She understood. The fire was not meant to destroy her. It was meant to make her give up before the one person who could formally stop Dodd walked into Willow Creek. I'll be standing, she said. Baines nodded once. I'll file the investigation. He walked toward his horse, then stopped. For what it's worth, Mrs. Bennett, what happened at that council meeting, what Anderson said, people are talking about it differently than they were before. He paused. I thought you should know that. He rode out. She turned back to the ruins. She had 9 days. She had 17 cattle, a stone-footed house, a man who could read any terrain you put in front of him, and a town that was slowly, imperfectly, improbably beginning to look at her differently than it had in July. She was not done. The next 7 days were the hardest she'd lived since the week Thomas died, and also the strangest because they were hard, in a way that was completely different. Hard. The way building is hard. Not hard. The way losing is hard. McGrath came with timber. Halverson came with labor. 2 men from the South Road, whose names she barely knew, showed up on Wednesday with hand tools and a willingness to work from sunup to dark without being asked. The Halverson boy worked alongside Caleb every day, and she watched something happen between them that she had no clean word for. The boy had grown up hearing the stories about Caleb Anderson, the mountain legend, and here was the man himself on 2 crutches in the dirt, directing the frame construction with an authority that had nothing to do with standing upright and everything to do with knowing exactly what he was talking about. On the 3rd day, she heard the boy ask Caleb about the mountains. Not about the accident. About the work, about the passes, the trails, the river crossings. And Caleb talked about it the way she'd never quite heard him talk about it before, freely, without the guarded quality he usually carried, as if the question had come from someone with no agenda and he could just answer it. She did not interrupt. She went around the other side of the frame and kept working, but she carried that sound with her the rest of the day. Caleb's voice, easy and alive, telling a 17-year-old boy about navigating the Clearwater Pass at night in early November, and she thought about the man who had arrived on her porch in June, looking at the mountains, the way you look at something that no longer belongs to you. He was wrong about that, she thought. The mountains hadn't stopped belonging to him. He'd just needed a different way of reaching them. On the 5th day, a letter arrived from the Denver Investment Group. Not an offer this time, but a formal withdrawal. The group was dissolving its partnership with Harlan Dodd, citing concerns related to the ongoing territorial inquiry. The language was careful and legal and meant to protect the investors. But the message underneath it was simple. The money that had been backing Dodd's acquisitions was stepping away. Lily read that letter at the kitchen table and then set it down and sat with it for a moment. Caleb came in and she slid it to him without speaking. He read it. Something crossed his face that took her a moment to identify because she'd seen it so rarely. Relief. Not the dramatic release of a man who expected rescue, but the quiet, deep relief of someone who has been holding a great weight and feels it begin to shift. He's alone, Caleb said. He's alone, she agreed. A man like Dodd without money behind him is a man without leverage. He set the letter down. He's not dangerous the same way anymore. He's still dangerous. Yes, but differently. He looked at her. The territorial agent arrives in 4 days. 4 days. The barn frame was up. The roof was partial. They'd need 2 more days to close it, but the cattle had shelter for the critical part of the night, and the feed she'd managed to salvage from McGrath's extra stores would carry them through October while she rebuilt the winter supply. She was still standing, barely, tired in her bones. $38 had become $62 because of 3 weeks of eggs and butter sold at the general store, which was not enough but was more than she'd had, and Thomas's ghost was very present in her kitchen those evenings, his voice in her memory saying, "It'll come around, Lily. It always comes around," and she used to find that optimism endearing and sometimes naive. But sitting in the kitchen in the lamplight with the letter from Denver in front of her, she thought he wasn't always wrong. Dodd came to the ranch himself on the 6th day. No Pryor, no Whitmore, no wagon, no documents, no performance of official purpose. He came alone on his horse in the mid-afternoon, and he tied up at the fence post and walked to the porch with the look of a man who has discarded his usual tools and is trying to figure out which ones he has left. Lily was on the porch when he arrived. She'd seen him coming from the South Road, and she'd stayed where she was and let him come to her. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. He looked at the barn frame behind her, at the repaired fence line, at the cattle visible in the north pasture, calm and grazing. "You're still here," he said. "I told you I would be." I was quiet for a moment. Whatever he'd prepared to say, she could see him measuring it against what he was looking at the ranch that had refused to break the woman who had refused to break with it, and finding that the prepared words didn't fit the situation he'd arrived at. "The inquiry," he started. "Yes. Whatever the agent finds will be accurate," she said. "Because the records are accurate. Pruitt's records, Greer's records, the pattern of your acquisitions, which I believe Judge Ells has described in considerable detail to the governor's office." She kept her voice even. "Is that what you came to talk about?" Dodd's jaw moved. "I came to make a final offer," he said. "No. You haven't heard. I don't need to hear it." She looked at him directly. "Mr. Dodd, I have turned down every offer you've made me since March. I have turned them down when I had $41 and a leaking roof. I have turned them down when you had a fraudulent legal claim filed against my deed. I turned down the offer your man delivered the day after the council meeting, and I'm turning down whatever number you've arrived at today." She stopped. "I am not selling this ranch. I was not selling it in March, and I am not selling it now, and the number you write on a piece of paper has never been the point." Dodd looked at her for a long moment. In his face behind the calculation and the careful social surface she saw something she hadn't expected. Not rage, not contempt, but something almost like understanding. The recognition of one stubborn person by another. "What is the point?" he asked, and it sounded improbably bizarrely like a genuine question. "Thomas built this," she said, "with his hands, on ground nobody else wanted. He didn't do it to create an asset for someone to acquire. He did it because this was going to be our life." She paused. "It's still my life. That's the point." Dodd stood at the base of the porch steps in the afternoon light, and he was a diminished thing compared to what he'd been in July. Not smaller physically, but emptied of the particular power that money and momentum had given him. And without those things, what remained was just a man who had spent years believing the frontier was a market and had encountered something it was not equipped to purchase. He looked at the barn frame one more time. "You'll need a good winter to recover from the fire," he said. It was not a threat. It was almost strangely an acknowledgement. "We'll have one," she said. He untied his horse. He rode out. She watched him go and felt not triumph, not yet, not quite, but the particular solidity of a door closing. The kind of closing that doesn't require slamming. Behind her the porch step creaked and she turned. Caleb was in the doorway. He'd heard. Of course he had. "He's not coming back," she said. "No." Caleb agreed. "Not to make an offer." She turned back and watched the dust of Dodd's horse settle on the South Road. "He might still make trouble with the inquiry," she said. "He'll try. But Ells has laid the groundwork too well." A pause. "Dodd's going to come out of this with his local land holdings intact, but his larger plans finished. He won't go to prison, men like him rarely do, but he'll be watched and he knows it." She absorbed that. The imperfect justice of it. The way the world so often resolved things not perfectly but enough. Enough, she said without meaning to say it out loud. Caleb tilted his head. What? Nothing. She turned away from the south road. Come help me with the roof section. McGrath's men are coming back at 2, and I want the east side of the frame braced before they get here. He moved out onto the porch beside her, and the afternoon was clear, and the cattle were calm, and the barn frame cast a long shadow across the yard. And she thought about what enough looked like, really looked like in a life. It looked like this. The territorial agent arrived on a Thursday morning, and his name was Cordell, and he was a compact, unreadable man of about 50, who had clearly investigated a great many things and was surprised by very few of them. He interviewed Lily for 2 hours in the land office. He interviewed Caleb for an hour. He spent the better part of a day with Greer going through the records. He spoke with McGrath and Halverson and Danforth and Asa Pruitt, who had come down from Clearwater specifically for the purpose, arriving the day before, with his original ledgers under his arm, and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to ask him the right questions. On the 4th day, Cordell interviewed Dodd. Nobody in Willow Creek was present for that interview, but the word that came out of it was consistent. Cordell was thorough. Dodd was careful, and the meeting lasted 3 hours. On the 5th day, Cordell filed his preliminary findings. Lily received a summary through Greer's office. The acquisition pattern had been found to constitute an attempt to monopolize water access in violation of the 1873 Act. The fraudulent land dispute filing had been formally noted. The fire investigation had been flagged for continued review pending Pryor's location. And the Territorial Governor's Office was recommending that all acquisition agreements made under the Denver Investment Group's authorization in the past 18 months be subject to legal review by the relevant parties. Stokes and Kerrigan, the 2 ranchers who had sold to Dodd, had grounds to challenge their agreements. Lily read the summary twice and handed it back to Greer without a word. She rode home. She tied the horse at the post and sat on the porch step in the afternoon. Thomas's porch step, the one Caleb had arrived on in June, on 2 crutches with his face turned away from her, and she sat there until the sun moved behind the ridge. She heard the door open behind her, heard the familiar rhythm of the crutches on the boards. Caleb sat down on the step beside her. They sat without speaking for a while, the way people sit together who have run out of things that need saying. "It's done," he asked finally. "It's done." A quiet. "Not all the way," she said. "The fire's still open. Dodd's still here. Stokes and Kerrigan have a long road to undo what they agreed to." She looked out at the land. "But the ranch is safe. The deed is clean. The water rights are formally protected." She stopped. "Thomas's work stands." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Yours too," he said. She looked at him. "You fought for 5 months," he said. "You turned down every exit. You found Pruitt, you went to that council meeting. You stood in front of Dodd on your own porch and said no one more time when you had every reason to be tired of saying it." He looked back at the land. "Thomas built the ranch. You saved it." She held that. She had not let herself think of it that way, had not let herself take that kind of ownership of what had happened, because taking ownership felt too close to declaring something over, and nothing had been over until it was. But he was looking at her with the directness he brought to every true thing, and she found she could not reframe it away from what it was. "We saved it," she said. He didn't argue. He accepted the correction with a slight nod, the way he accepted accurate information. They sat on the porch step as the evening came in, and neither of them moved. 3 weeks later, the barn was finished. McGrath and Halverson and 6 men from the South Road turned out on a Saturday to close the roof and hang the doors and help carry in the first load of winter feed. And by the end of the day, the structure stood solid and new and smelling of fresh pine. And someone had brought food, and someone else had brought a fiddle. And in the yard of the Bennett Ranch, there was improbably and genuinely a kind of celebration. Lily stood at the edge of it and watched her neighbors on her land. The same neighbors who had looked away from her in June, who had politely agreed that the widow probably wouldn't last the year, who had taken Dodd's version of the future for granted until they had been shown a different one, and she did not feel bitterness about the distance they'd kept. She was too tired for bitterness and too far past it. She felt something simpler. Gratitude, maybe. The complicated kind. Caleb was across the yard near the barn door, and the Halverson boy was beside him, and two other men she recognized from the road-building crew, and they were listening to him, actually listening, leaning in the way people lean toward a voice that knows what it's talking about. He was gesturing toward the roofline, making some point about the pitch and the snow load and Wyoming winters, and the men were nodding, and there was nothing in that circle of people that resembled how the town had spoken about Caleb Anderson in June. The paralyzed mountain cowboy, the burden, the cruel joke. She looked at him, and she thought about everything she'd believed and disbelieved and learned since the morning Dodd's wagon had rolled down her track, and she thought about what it cost a person to put themselves back together after the world has told them in every available language that they are finished, and she thought that she was looking at someone who had done that, who was doing that one repair at a time, one fixed hinge, and rebuilt water channel and public stand in front of a hostel room at a time. And she thought about what it cost a person to decide to trust again, after trust had mostly cost them things, and she thought she might be doing that too. He caught her looking. He held her gaze for a moment from across the yard. She did not look away, neither did he. McGrath appeared at her shoulder with 2 cups of coffee, oblivious and well-intentioned, and she took the cup and thanked him and turned back to the party, and the fiddle started up, and the yard was warm with lamplight and voices, and the new barn stood at the edge of it all, solid and real. Later, when most people had gone home and the yard was quiet, and the stars had come out hard and clear, the way they do on cold Wyoming nights, Lily was carrying the last of the tin cups inside when she found Caleb on the porch. He was looking at the mountains, the same way he'd looked at them from the back of the wagon on the day he'd arrived, but different. The same posture, the same direction, but the quality of the looking had changed. Then he had been looking at something he'd lost. Now he was looking at something that was still his. She stopped beside him and looked where he was looking. The mountains in the dark were enormous and still, and covered in the higher elevations with the first early snow of the year. "You miss them," she said. "Every day," he said. "That doesn't change." But he was quiet for a moment. "But I found out that there's more than one kind of terrain worth knowing," he said, "and more than one kind of work worth doing." She looked at him. "Are you staying?" she asked. The question was direct in the way that only very important questions can afford to be, and she asked it without softening it, because she was too tired for soft and too invested in the answer for anything less than the truth. Caleb turned from the mountains and looked at her. "You asking me to stay?" She held his gaze. "I'm asking if you want to." He looked at her for a long moment, the same steady, clear-eyed looking he gave to terrain. He was about to navigate reading the actual lay of things instead of the things he wished were there. "Yes," he said, "I want to stay." She nodded once. She went inside. He stood on the porch a moment longer, and the mountains were behind him, and the lamplight was in front of him, and the ranch that everyone had expected to fail was quiet and whole around him, and he turned away from the dark and followed the light inside. Years later, the people of Willow Creek would tell the story of that summer, the way communities tell the stories. They need not always accurately, but always with a kind of reverence for what they'd almost missed. They would talk about the town council meeting and the legal ledger and the judge's letter from Laramie. They would talk about the fire and the barn that rose from it. They would talk about a woman who said no so many times and in so many different ways that the word eventually became a wall that nothing could scale. And they would talk about Caleb Anderson. Not the paralyzed mountain cowboy. Not the man who couldn't stand. Not the burden the town had tried to file away in the back room of a boarding house and forget about. They would talk about the man who walked into a hostel room on 2 crutches and named what everyone else had been afraid to name. The man who read terrain, any terrain, physical or human, with a clarity that cut through noise and got to the actual shape of things. The man who had come to a widow's ranch as a joke and built it into the most solid operation in the valley. Dodd left Willow Creek the following spring. The territorial inquiry had cost him his political standing and most of his larger ambitions. He left quietly, which was in its own way a kind of answer to everything. Stokes got his land back. Kerrigan got a settlement. Pruitt came down from Clearwater twice a year and drank coffee in Lily's kitchen, and argued good-naturedly with Caleb about water grades and survey methodology, and the time in the winter of '81, when Caleb had read a trail wrong, and they'd spent an extra 2 days in the high country in November, a story that never lost anything in the retelling. Halverson became a constant a neighbor in the real sense, the kind you can count on before you ask. His boy grew up and eventually went to Laramie to study land law, and Caleb wrote him a letter of introduction to Judge Els that the boy kept for the rest of his life. And on the Bennett Ranch, which was what people kept calling it, and what Lily never corrected them on because the name was Thomas's name, and Thomas had earned it, the irrigation channel ran clean through the dry summers. The cattle were healthy. The barn stood. On a morning in the late fall of 1886, just over a year from the day a wagon had rolled down the track with a man who did not want to be there, Caleb Anderson came in from checking the cattle and found Lily at the kitchen table with the deed to the property in front of her and a pen in her hand. He stopped. "What are you doing?" he asked. She looked up. "Adding a name," she said. "If you're staying, you should be part of what you helped save." He looked in at the deed, at the pen, at her face. He crossed the kitchen without another word and sat down across from her, and she slid the pen toward him, and outside the wind was moving through the valley, and the mountains stood against the sky, the same way they had always stood, unmoved by everything that happened beneath them. He picked up the pen. He signed his name on the line she had drawn in the handwriting of a man who had once believed the only thing he had left to write was an ending, and had discovered instead that what he'd been writing all along was something worth continuing. The ranch was theirs. The land was real. And two people the frontier had tried to discard had instead become the very thing the frontier would remember. Proof that what gets broken is not always what gets lost, and what gets lost is not always gone. And the joke the town of Willow Creek told in the summer of 1885 became in the fullness of time the proudest story they ever claimed as their own.